Good morning. We will have the session with Nadine Lake, that is part of a fellowship, Erasmus Plus, and it has been like dates during the activities that we have for the week of LGBTE plus, against LGBTE plus phobia. So I would like first to introduce Nadine, like her bio, like a short one, and then Nadine will present her dissertation, and afterwards we will just try to see if there are some questions around the topic in order to discuss. So Dr. Nadine Lake is a senior lecturer and director of the Gender Studies program in the Center for Gender and Africa Studies at the University of the Free State in South Africa. Nadine has been appointed as a lecturer at the Free State University in South Africa since 2011 and teaches courses including gender and sexuality, feminist research methodologies, gender and culture, and gender and development, to name just a few. She was awarded as Erasmus Mundus Scholarship and spent 22 months at the Center for Gender Research in Uppsala University, Sweden. This scholarship enabled her to complete her PhD entitled Corrective Rape and Black Lesbian Sexualities in Contemporary South African Cultural Texts back to 2017. Nadine is collaborating with Uppsala University and the University of Eduardo Mondlane in Mozambique on a Swedish International Development Agency research project titled Gender Mainstreaming, Developing Competencies in Higher Education for Gender Equality, Peace Building, and Gender-Sensitive Research Coordinators. The primary objective of the 5-year research project is to create an enabling environment for gender-sensitive research and researchers at the University of Eduardo Mondlane in Mozambique. She has presented workshops on gender-based violence and facilitated workshops on PhD and master's supervisions for students at the University of Eduardo Mondlane, the University of Free States, and Uppsala University. Nadine's research interests include African queer theories, lesbian sexuality, gender-based violence in Southern Africa, intersectionality, and postcolonial critique. Nadine has published work on queer archives and lesbian sexualities with the book, Rowledge, African Insight, and Scrutiny too. So we are very welcome to have Nadine with us and hope that you enjoy the conference. So Nadine, welcome. Thank you very much to stay with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rosa, and thank you for the introduction and the short bio. It's really a pleasure to be at Universitat Pompeu Fabra this week, and I say thank you to the Center for Gender Equality for arranging this as well in the week of LGBTQI issues. So it's a very exciting time to be at Universitat Pompeu Fabra, and I am happy to be speaking about my research this morning as well. So welcome to everybody. So today I'm going to speak about my research, which has focused on corrective rape of Black lesbian sexualities in South Africa. A feminist activist approach. And I have titled this, the talk today, a feminist activist approach, because I think it's very important to foreground the issues of sexualities in Africa from a feminist perspective, and to really prioritize the importance of LGBTQI issues in Africa, but also from a transnational perspective. And my PhD research, as mentioned by Rosa, is also focused particularly on a type of gender-based violence which has happened in South Africa, which has been coined the term corrective rape, with the focus specifically being on Black lesbian women. And so when I started to focus on this research, I had a number of questions that interested me when I started with my PhD research in 2013, 2014. And one of the dominant questions which I was asking myself is, in post-apartheid South Africa, where are lesbian women? And particularly, why are Black lesbian women being represented as violated or abused? With the cover presentation today, there's an image of Zanele Moholi, a South African artist and activist who has conducted a lot of research through her activism, and then also who has produced the largest body of work, photographic work on Black lesbian women. And so today I am going to speak to the issue of corrective rape and the work of Zanele Moholi in South Africa. Right, so I've titled this, if I think about corrective rape and gender-based violence in South Africa, one of the issues that comes to mind is the homophobic everyday, the way in which LGBTQIA+ individuals are immersed in a homophobic reality. And so if one starts to investigate lesbophobic violence or homophobic violence in South Africa, it becomes clear through newspaper reporting that the term corrective rape started to circulate more in a more prevalent way since 2003. And the definition, or the initial definition that was given to homophobic violence perpetrated against Black lesbian women was corrective rape. And so the definition is the rape of lesbian women by heterosexual men in order to correct or cure their lesbian sexual orientation. Now, this very bogus idea to rape a lesbian woman in order to correct her sexuality is very much immersed in heteronormative ideas and very strict normative notions of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. And these ideas are very much in contrast with South Africa's liberal and democratic South African Constitution, which was adopted in 1996. And the South African Constitution is important in this regard because it enshrines the rights of people regardless of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, ethnicity, language, religion, and ability, to name a few of the human rights that exist in South Africa. And so if we look at a homophobic reality versus a democratic constitution, we see a significant paradox between a country which is struggling to confront some of these conservative notions around homophobia versus a liberal and democratic constitution in South Africa. And the high statistics and evidence of gender-based violence in South Africa have been investigated by African feminist scholars such as Pumla Gola, who reported on the high rape incidents in South Africa as a rape culture. So it's become very prevalent to speak of South Africa in terms of gender-based violence, homophobia, and this contrast between aspiring to be more open, to be accommodating, to be liberal and accepting versus conservative norms, as it is with many other countries in the world. Right, so if we take a look at the statistics, we see that in 2020-2021, there were 36,330 reported cases of rape in South Africa. These are not cases of corrective rape, but these are inclusive of all rape cases that had been reported to the South African Police Service. It's a very high incidence of rape, given that many cases in the country go unreported, and for the fact that rape and sexual violence and gender-based violence has acquired quite a normative stance and association in the country. It is also, however, important to consider the fact and the context within which we are speaking when we talk about corrective rape. South Africa is a country which is characterized by inequality due to its separate and segregated past of apartheid. But South Africa is also considered unique on the African continent because of its liberal constitution. So South Africa, for instance, was the first country in the world to safeguard sexual orientation in the constitution, and same-sex marriage has been legal in the country since 2006 through the Civil Union Act. And if we look at other scholars in South Africa, such as Helen Moffat, in 2006 she wrote that the recent history of legislated inequality, referring to apartheid, was so aberrant and was so unequal that the rights were endorsed and guaranteed across the spectrum of race, gender, class, ethnicity, religion, language, level of ability, sexual orientation, or preference. So if scholars have argued that within countries that are deeply divided and unequal, it became very significant to take a step that would guarantee the rights for everybody across the spectrum of human rights. Right, so corrective rape. Corrective rape is a term which is also problematic, and we will look at some of the definitions and the difficulty with defining corrective rape in South Africa. So journalists Yolanda Mufweba and Zolile Bengu reported on the high number of lesbians coming forward with accounts of rape, assault, and homophobia-driven attacks in South Africa in 2003. The first focus was on black lesbian women in Johannesburg who felt very unsafe and started coming forward to non-governmental and non-profit organizations to report crimes to these organizations, but who also expressed their difficulty in speaking about the violence for the fear of re-victimization because they identified as lesbian. Black lesbians have been identified as the primary targets of corrective rape, and it is emphasized that deviating from a heteronormative status of heterofemininity is often met with contempt and punishment. So these are very conservative notions that start to come forward, that if one deviates from what it means to conservatively and traditionally be a woman, there is some type of punishment, contempt, and violence that is perpetrated against women. So news articles like this one by Yolanda Mufweba and Zolile Bengu provide a very necessary context for understanding how the black lesbian women who have been victimized are also represented in South Africa. So we see that when we look at news reporting on corrective rape, that black lesbian women are represented as voiceless victims of violence, and black men are often reported as rapists who are remorseless and act with impunity. Now, these types of definitions of lesbian sexuality and men's sexuality, or black men's sexuality, need to be problematized because of the very dominant stereotypes that emerge around African sexualities. So previous definitions and stereotypes which are related to the fact that African sexuality is deviant, that lesbian sexuality is not allowed or impermissible, needs to be challenged. And we can see that news texts and reporting on corrective rape often reproduce the normative and conservative notions of sexuality that have existed since colonial times in Africa. So, corrective rape is an interesting term because it has been used to draw attention to a very specific form of rape. However, it is also problematic, and I've titled this a discursive conundrum. In other words, the term corrective rape is used as a factual event that happens and which remains unproblematized in South African and global print media reporting. What becomes interesting about the term corrective rape as well is that it gains this type of special status of something that only happens in South Africa or a few other African countries. For instance, corrective rape, if one looks at the research, one can see that the country where corrective rape is reported on is predominantly South Africa, and a few other countries which are mentioned are countries such as Zimbabwe, Uganda, Jamaica, and Botswana. So it would appear that corrective rape is unique to the South African context. This is also reported and reinforced and reproduced by the idea that lesbian sexuality in Africa is un-African, is un-Christian, and it is unnatural, which is a very common trope in global and local print media. An interesting article, however, was published by the scholar Madhumita Lahiri in an article entitled Crimes and Corrections, Bride Burners, Corrective Rapists, and Other Black Misogynists. And Madhumita Lahiri does something and achieves something important in terms of challenging the language which is used around violence, which is perpetrated against vulnerable bodies in developing countries such as India and South Africa. And so Lahiri argues that the corrective portion, if we look at the term corrective rape, the corrective portion of corrective rape refers to the alleged motivations of the perpetrator. And this desire is usually glossed as being a belief that the exposure to heterosexual intercourse, even under conditions of coercion, would correct the deviant sexual orientation of women presumed to be lesbian. To some extent, this terminology is only as problematic as its purported explanation. It would be quite reasonable, for example, to affirm that these sorts of attacks are correctional in that they punish those who challenge dominant ideas of gender and sexuality. So in other words, Madhumita Lahiri looks at two sides of the coin when looking at the term corrective rape. The way in which it is traditionally used, corrective rape, is that the perpetrator is correcting the lesbian sexuality of a woman. But Lahiri is arguing that the fact that lesbian women are identifying differently means that there is a type of correction, which a correctional attitude which is held by perpetrators, but also where she states that they are correctional in that they punish those who challenge the normative and the dominant ideas of gender and sexuality. So we should not only see this as a perpetrated act against black lesbian women, but we should understand it within the notion of the fact that if one acts differently or assumes a different identity, that there are very conservative consequences and violent consequences for those who deviate from the norm. Right, so if we take a look at racial and sexual legacies of violence, we need to understand South Africa within this context as well. Right, so the spectacular and the very gruesome way in which black lesbian women have been represented in the media and the representation of violence against lesbians has resulted in a very specific form of othering, which is revealing of racist and sexist political ideologies. So one needs to understand violence from an intersectional perspective, and one needs to understand the context within which it takes place. So a discursive analysis of corrective rape, when one takes a look at corrective rape from a post-colonial and feminist perspective, the common message that African women's bodies are not their own and that African men are often homophobic and rapists comes to the fore. So if one had to look at these cases in isolation without applying a feminist and post-colonial lens, one holds there is a cautionary stance around this, not to look at these cases as unique to Africa, but to apply a post-colonial and feminist perspective in order to caution against these heteronormative notions, which in fact reproduce the possibility to perpetrate violence against vulnerable bodies. There is a failure to interrogate the Eurocentric and dominant discourses of power and intersectional categories of discrimination, which often results in the re-emergence of racialized and sexualized master narratives that have been present during colonial times and during the apartheid years in South Africa. And if we look at contemporary society, we can see the reproduction of these post-colonial realities, not only in Africa, but also in Europe, in the United States, in Australia, in Asia, and in the rest of the world. However, certain stereotypes have attached themselves more firmly to less privileged and more vulnerable bodies in contexts such as South Africa. So according to Desiree Lewis, a South African academic and scholar, Lewis argues that if we want to explore African sexualities carefully, this means exploring how they have traditionally been thought about. It requires what Kwame Appiah described as a discursive space clearing, a way of both acknowledging and analyzing how others have historically been imagined. And so the idea of imagination becomes central to imagining a different future, but also paying attention to the way in which people have been imagined historically. So if we look at the issue of corrective rape, one will find a lot of horrific stories around corrective rape. And one of the videos on this issue, entitled "South African Women Fall Victim to Corrective Rape," records and documents a young man who is interviewed about the phenomenon of corrective rape, and he states, "My idea is to say, let's turn their minds to be normal because right now they're being inhuman." He refers to lesbian sexuality as something that is inhuman. So it's almost something that cannot be understood and therefore which falls outside of, and so we can see the very firm and integrated relationship between sexuality and humanity, making lesbian women in the country more vulnerable to violence because they are considered less than human and therefore become more vulnerable and open and precarious bodies. Right, so if I continue, we need to think about the way in which lesbian sexuality has been framed. And from a theoretical perspective, Judith Butler has conducted and written some very important work around the framing of vulnerable bodies and the ability to frame situations or incidents of war in such a way that it enables us to reimagine a one-dimensional representation of lesbian life. So we need to think about how a lesbian feminist approach can actually queer these normative notions of being. If one goes back to the work of Teresa de Lauretis, she states that in the very act of assuming and speaking from the position of subject, a woman could and can currently recognize women as subjects and objects of female desire. So lesbian feminism is thus very important for regarding women loving other women as an entity which stands apart from the very heteronormative assumptions and definitions of lesbians' lives. So with Judith Butler, in terms of framing lesbian life, if one thinks of a frame, Judith Butler argues that the fact that something has been framed, for instance, to state that homosexuality is un-African, un-Christian, and unnatural, the fact that it has been framed in such a way means that something exists outside of the frame. So in a sense, what I would like to argue is that within that frame, one needs to apply an intersectional, a post-colonial, a feminist and a lesbian feminist theoretical lens in order to understand the context better. So for these productive arguments around frames are identified and are elaborated on in Judith Butler's text entitled Frames of War, which was published in 2009. Butler illustrates how frames have been used to legitimize war and violence against certain bodies. For Butler, a differential or a different allocation of precariousness or vulnerability, which attaches itself to certain lives, plays an influential role in framing some people as less valuable than others. I think that Judith Butler's theoretical lens is very productive in terms of understanding the issue of rape, gender-based violence, and corrective rape, and the vulnerability which has been attached to specific lives in South Africa. So if we continue, so for Butler, and just to reiterate and to emphasize this point, the frame, that which is represented, itself signifies something which exists outside the frame. She writes, "To call the frame into question is to show that the frame never quite contained the scene that it was meant to limn." So to call the frame into question, as with photography, is to illustrate that it never quite contained that actual scene that it was meant to circumscribe or to cut off. but that something exists outside of the frame of corrective rape or war or the vulnerability of bodies that are affected by these types of violence. So therefore, to call the frame into question forms part of calling power dynamics into question, and it illustrates that there is potential to reimagine the framed scene or subject, the potential to imagine a different contemporary existence and a different future for LGBT lives. So for me, it was important within my PhD research and in the research that I am focusing on now to look at a concept of what is currently and in contemporary times being referred to as the queer archive. If we look at scholars who are working on queer archives, we think of scholars such as Anne Kvetkovic, we think of works by José Munoz, we think of works by Carmen Maria Machado, who brought out her memoir in 2019 entitled In the Dream House. And one of the major contributions within South Africa has been Zanele Moholi's visual activism, which has been defined and described as a queer archive. So Zanele Moholi is a South African photographer and a queer activist, and she has brought out 3 publications, of which 2 focused specifically on the first being Only Half the Picture, looking at hate crime in particular perpetrated against lesbian women in South Africa, and the second and one of the most significant bodies of work of Zanele Moholi is this work entitled Faces and Phases 2006 to 2014, published in 2014. And so Zanele Moholi in her work published 258 portrait photographs of black lesbians and transgender men in a collection entitled Faces and Phases, spanning over the period of 2006 to 2014. The archive, or Zanele Moholi's work, constitutes a very significant entry into the queer archive, and specifically into the African queer archive, which illustrates and which represents and which gives an opportunity for black lesbian women and transgender men to represent themselves, to narrate their stories, to identify and to reflect upon subjective experiences of identity, but also subjective experiences of violence. It also constitutes an opportunity to speak back to the very pervasive violence in the lives of black lesbian women and transgender men. And Zanele Moholi herself writes in 2014 that the work Faces and Phases is both highly personal and deeply political. It is an act of searching, of resisting, transgressing the boundaries of oppressive racial, sexual, class, and gender power structures. In other words, Zanele Moholi's work is not only about sexuality and sexual orientation, but it reflects on the intersectional categories of oppressive racial, sexual, class, and gender power structures, and the manner in which they intersect to make lives even more precarious and more vulnerable when sexuality is considered in these intersectional categories. One of the quotes from Faces and Phases is important in this regard, where it is written, "They might swear at us as much as they want to, beat us up, rape and murder us, but they won't get to our souls. Our inner beauty will remain. It will be expressed in every special way." Right. I think that it is quite important within the context of Zanele Moholi's work to consider global narratives and global evidence of homophobia, queerphobia, and transphobia. This is also very important in terms of providing a counter-narrative or a counter-discourse to the dominant idea that homosexuality or lesbian sexuality is un-African, un-Christian, and unnatural. If one wants to challenge these types of narratives, we need to look at homophobic and lesbophobic violence outside of the context of focusing uniquely and specifically on Africa, but we need to emphasize and foreground the fact that homophobia, transphobia, and lesbophobia is a global phenomenon, and that certain narratives have gained more attention than others, but within Africa, certain stereotypes have emerged more prominently. So, Zanele Moholi writes in her collection of work entitled Faces and Phases, she dedicates the book to her mother, Besta Moholi, and she writes, "To my late mother, Besta Moholi, and to all mothers who gave birth to LGBTI children in Africa and beyond, and to those mothers who have lost their children to hate crime-related violence, we continue to mourn with you. You are not alone." This is significant in terms of providing the queer community with a context within which to be understood within families. So to challenge the heteronormative notion of belonging and the heteronormative notion of national belonging within countries, to say that queer mothers mourn their children who have been affected by and lost to homophobic violence. And furthermore, the documentation of the queer community within and beyond South Africa's borders represented in Moholi's work makes an important statement about the global impact of homophobia, something which is not unique to Africa or to South Africa. Right, so transnational LGBTQI identities also in Faces and Phases becomes a reality through the fact that the identities, the narratives, the portraits of individuals in Faces and Phases are not only from South Africa, but from different parts of the world. Gabiba Badaroon, for instance, writes that these are portraits of black lesbians and trans men from Mafeking, Durban, Gaborone, Johannesburg, Toronto, Paarl, London, and Cape Town. Right, so giving us a sense that this is not only about South Africa, but that these narratives extend beyond the borders of Africa. The transnational inclusion of LGBT narratives from different parts of the world also challenges the idea that Western democracies are always liberal, always gay-friendly, always democratic. And so it challenges this very pervasive idea of pinkwashing, which can sometimes detract from the notion that there is Western conservatism, and by critiquing homophobia in the rest of the world, especially in Africa. Right, so one needs to move away from the idea and the notion that Western countries are always gay-friendly. This can often detract from other issues that are prevalent, such as xenophobia, racism, and various other inequalities that affect people within Western countries. Right, so within my research, I've identified three major themes that are specific to Zanele Moholi's work, and these themes are survivability, mourning, and belonging. Right, these themes are important also in terms of the way in which subject stories are narrated by Black lesbians and transgender men in South Africa and beyond African borders. So the first important thing to remember is that the narratives, although traumatic and characterized by difficulty, are stories of survivability and not of defeat. Right, so these narratives of survival in Moholi's collection include both physical and psychic traumas, such as rape, contracting HIV, losing partners, coming out, and experiencing rejection from family members. However, these are stories of survival and not of defeat. They are also narratives of belonging to families, of belonging to LGBT organizations, of coming out and being accepted, and of also identifying positively as lesbians and transgender men. Moholi, within this context, writes that as Black lesbian women and gay men today, we are challenging homophobia, queerphobia, transphobia, simply by living our lives. We put ourselves at risk in the townships by coming out and being seen, but we refuse to comply and to deny our own existence. So there's a strong emphasis on survivability within the Black lesbian community within South Africa, without detracting from the fact that there is danger in identifying as lesbian or queer or transgender. Zanele makes this, does not try to take away from this, but emphasizes the agency of Black lesbians and transgender men in moving forward with their lives. One of the narratives, for instance, is by a lesbian-identified participant. And so it's important to think of the role of lesbian and transgender people in Faces and Phases, that these are participant narratives, that they are not only documentation, but that they form part of a collection in which the story of LGBT life in Africa is being told from a community perspective and not being documented only by one single person. So Nonhlanhla Sigasa, for instance, states, and she writes, I have 2 birthdays. I was born on 10 October and I was diagnosed HIV positive in February. So each and every 15 February, my HIV status turns a year older and I get to live another year. So this is a story of survival, surviving despite being diagnosed HIV positive and continuing to live despite being diagnosed with HIV at a young age. Funeka Soldaat is an LGBT activist and the founder of the South African organization called Free Gender in Cape Town. This organization helps victims of homophobic violence and corrective rape. Soldaat is therefore doing very important work in this area, and one of Soldaat's hopes is for a future where there will be no need for gay and lesbian organizations in Khayelitsha, Cape Town, because of the complexities, the traumas, and the sexual violence which is so prevalent in these communities. Right, the second theme which I identified in Zanele Moholi's work is that of mourning. Mourning and grieving the lives of community members that have been erased and lost through sexual violence, through rape and murder. The act of mourning, the act of documenting, and the act of remembering the lives of the queer community, who are often represented as vulnerable, precarious, ungrievable in the public sphere, plays a very important role in and an important affective role in restoring the recognizability, the value, and the intelligibility of queer life in Africa. Moholi's archive, or Moholi's entry into the archive, includes portraits of people who have passed away. So not only those who continue to live, but those who are no longer with us, but continue to live on within our memory. The first photograph taken for Faces and Phases was that of Busi Sigasa, a lesbian woman who contracted HIV from rape and died a year after her photograph was taken at the tender age of 25. So this was the first photograph taken for Faces and Phases, but appears as the last photograph within the collection of the 258 photographs in Faces and Phases. Memory and belonging and grieving also act as a method of living on beyond the boundaries of the body, beyond the heteronormative notions of erasure of queer life. And so therefore mourning becomes a significant act and theme in this collection. I'd like to read something from Busi Sigasa's poem. This is not the full poem, but something that Sigasa writes in terms of, wrote about her life. Remember me when I'm gone, for I wrote stories for the nations to read. I stood without fear and I told my story. I smiled and greeted without judging. I influenced positive living to the sick. I planted seeds of hope to the hopeless. I groomed and growed the younger ones whose parents died. I created artistic devices with my hands. I crafted and I drew beautiful pictures. I installed educational reasoning to some. I taught, represented the minority to the majority. I made nations aware. I wronged some and I made some happy. I survived against the odds. Some would say I'm full of shit, but spiritually I was full. I was fed with God's glory, that's why I praised Him. I praised Him more than my friends. I am my mother's daughter. I made history and marked the historical books of this world. So, remember me when I'm gone, for without no doubt I am in peace with my Maker and Creator. So these are stories of survivability, of mourning, of intelligibility, of creating an impact that survives beyond the boundaries of the body, and also which resists and challenges the erasure of queer life in Africa. The final theme which I have identified in Moholi's work is that of belonging, and which other scholars have also identified. Elements of this queer archive of Moholi combine to form a new type of belonging, not a belonging to heteronormative national scripts of belonging, but to one that resists hetero or cis-normative national scripts of patriarchal belonging, of homophobia. These are narratives that challenge and that start to create imaginary and also utopian forms of belonging that challenge these normative boundaries. Belonging is scripted into Faces and Faces to describe belonging to families and to identification with LGBTQ communities, organizations, and collectives. And if we look at the narration of Amogelang Senokwane, they write about their coming out process, asserting that most of their family members, in fact, accepted them as queer. Senokwane writes, Faces and Phases has helped me a lot, because when I saw my family who saw the book and saw me and other lesbians there, it made them more proud of me, and it made them understand that there are lesbians out there and that we are here to stay, resisting homophobia. And then one of the final narratives of belonging, which I want to foreground and emphasize, is by Pamela Dlungwana. And this is important in terms of the activist feminist approach in Zanele Moholi's work as well, is that Pamela Dlungwana, as she stares back at the camera, she confidently asserts and states, I wanted to insert myself, therefore a choice. I wanted to insert myself into an archive that was still learning its ABCs. There are all kinds of African queers out there, dominatrixes and leather boys and tranny lesbian MTFs. The vocab and the archive are growing. And I'm glad that Zanele Moholi is standing front and center with a canon God knows what in her hand, ready to help with the script. So this is very significant for the queer archive. Right, and so if one has a look at this statement by Pamela Dlungwana, it's really significant to see that the queer archive is being contextualized here in terms of a growing vocabulary. The ABCs of this vocabulary, as Dlungwana emphasizes, are expanding. There is a script which is being told and which is being elaborated on by activists and artists and participants to the queer project in South Africa and beyond. And so participant narratives of queer survival, of queer mourning and queer belonging are very significant for the archive, which continues to grow and which connects with queer communities in the rest of the world. And so I would like to end with a few comments, which is that portraits, poems, narratives, biographies form a central part of expanding this LGBTQ archive in Africa and beyond. The LGBT community in this archive challenge lesbian, transgender erasure and loss through telling stories of survival, of mourning, of remembering, of grieving and belonging. And it is Moholi's work, as well as others, that contest a one-dimensional narrative of queer life and of violence and corrective rape, which is often ascribed to Black, African, lesbian, and transgender sexuality and identity, but works such as that of Zanele Moholi, of Nkabinde, of queer scholars within Africa are starting to challenge this normative association of violence, which attaches itself to the African queer body, but starts to foreground and emphasize stories of survivability, of subjectivity, and of queer belonging, which is not only a narrative unique to Africa, but also to the rest of the world. So thank you very much. Thank you.
I don't know. And now it's working? Yeah. I just have a question of such a rich research, and a question that I have for more like cultural perspective is, how have you shared this research with the people you work, the work that you analyze, and which is the reception, and also which kind of reception you have in different audiences in relation to these topics that you talk? And I think that at some point it can have some debate or not accept critique.
Okay, thank you very much for your question as well. That's a very important question because the reception of the topic also depends, of course, of the context within which you find yourself. And so my research is shared within South Africa among student populations and also within the university community, at conferences in South Africa, among the younger LGBTI community in South Africa. And I've received positive reception within South Africa on this topic. But I think it's also very important to consider and to reflect one's own social location in relation to the topic as well. And so because of South Africa's history of inequality, the issue of identity is also complex. And so to identify and to relate has often been defined in very racialized terms within South Africa. And so when I was thinking about the PhD project also, a question that would regularly come up in terms of my own research is that, do I have the right to speak on behalf of others as well? And so it's very important to reflect on this. And so when I considered my work and my own identity as a lesbian woman myself, I considered that a very important aspect of the research. But I'd also as somebody who identifies as South African and who adds to the narrative of often participants who cannot tell their stories because of less privileged spaces within which they find themselves. So I think it's really important to reflect on one's insider status in terms of your sexuality, but also to reflect on one's outsider status in terms of race and social location and histories of privilege, and really to be sensitive to these notions of one's own social location in order to contribute in a way that will not detract from the intelligibility of black lesbian women, but to add to the textured narratives that exist in South Africa and in Africa. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Nadine. And I think that we maybe can finish here also the recording, and maybe we can think how we can just delegate questions, because I think that it's not a conversation allowed right now. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for this opportunity as well. It's wonderful to be in Barcelona and at the University of Pompeu Fabra, and it's really great for me to have the opportunity to share my research, and also to thank the Centre for Gender Equality, which is doing such important work at this university. So thank you.